Welcome, dear listener, to a journey through time into the hunger-filled shadows of medieval life. As you settle in for a restorative sleep or a moment of calm, I invite your mind to drift into the creaking wooden cottages and mist-laden fields of a world where food was more prayer than pleasure. Before we begin our story, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there. Feel free to leave a comment and share. It's always a joy to see our global community gathering for these gentle historical journeys, and if you resonate with this soft and immersive style of storytelling, a quiet click on the subscribe button would be much appreciated. It's thoughtful listeners like you who keep this series of historical tales flowing smoothly. Close your eyes if you'd like. Let the dim candlelight flicker in your mind's eye, casting golden shadows on the uneven stone walls of a small, smoky hut. Outside, the winter wind murmurs through the leafless trees, pressing against the door like a cold hand searching for warmth. Inside, a woman stirs a pot over a meager fire. The smell is faint, earthy, thin, more memory than meal. Beside her, a child waits silently, rubbing their belly as the hollow gurgle of hunger echoes louder than any words. In the medieval world, to eat was never guaranteed. Food was not indulgence, it was endurance. Not a source of joy, but of daily anxiety, a need that was too often unmet. Eating was not a ritual of taste, but of survival. For the vast majority of people, food was scarce, irregular, and deeply tied to the unpredictable rhythms of nature, the cruel decisions of landowners, and the suffocating grip of faith. Let your thoughts drift to a time when there were no refrigerators, no supermarkets, no pantries lined with choice. Instead, the seasons ruled every table. A harsh winter could empty a village's stores before the snow even settled. A single bad harvest could mean the difference between life and death. Droughts, floods, or locusts weren't abstract threats. They were omens. Imagine waking each morning not with the question of what you will eat, but whether you will eat. Imagine a life where bread, just a piece of coarse, rough bread, was both a dream and a memory, where every grain of wheat was counted, guarded, and hoped for. The people of the Middle Ages lived under the constant shadow of hunger. It was not a visitor, but a resident. Not a passing threat, but a daily companion. The rhythm of their lives followed the ebb and flow of food. The sound of grinding mills and cracking wheat filled the air when times were good. But in harder days, silence took over. Silence in the kitchens, silence in the fields, silence in the cries of children too tired to call out. And through that silence, life still went on, slowly, achingly, but relentlessly. You see, while nobles dined on venison under the vaulted ceilings of stone halls, while priests filled their tables with fish and ale behind monastic walls, countless others sat before empty bowls. In the silence of that absence, where the spoon scraped nothing and the pot boiled only water, there was a quiet form of despair that rarely found its way into the annals of history. The church bells still rang, calling the faithful to prayer, but prayers for food were whispered more often than sung. Under the shadow of stained glass and beneath crumbling thatched roofs, a simple plea echoed through the land, just enough to survive, just enough to make it through one more night. Tonight, we begin a long, slow journey through these absences, through fields of withered wheat and crumbling bread crusts, through the soft cries of children too weak to cry loud, through winters that came early and left late, through the desperation that turned bark into flower and flower into hope. Let us remember, hunger was not an occasional visitor in the Middle Ages. It was a constant companion. It shaped the way people prayed as they begged not for abundance but for enough. It dictated how they worked, every movement weighed down by fatigue. It determined how they died, quietly, invisibly, and too soon. And still somehow, they endured. With cracked hands and empty bellies, they endured. Through seasons of cold and scarcity, through years of war and taxation, they endured. Their survival was not loud or heroic. It was humble, invisible, and real. So if you're lying awake tonight, feeling the ache of uncertainty or the gnawing of something missing, know this: you are not alone. Many, in many times, have felt what you feel now. Their stories were not always written down, but they remain in whispers, in silences, in the soft pulse of memory. Let us begin. Perhaps you're listening in the quiet hush of night in a still room where only the occasional creak of the walls or a far-off hum fills the silence. In this softened space, let your thoughts drift back nearly 1,000 years to a world dimly lit by oil lamps, where smoke curled slowly in thatched roof cottages and coal seeped up from the earth itself. To eat in the medieval era was not an act of pleasure or leisure. It was a challenge marked by invisibility, by waiting, by stillness. Each day began with uncertainty, a gnawing question that underlay all others. Would there be food? Would the fire burn long enough to soften the roots or boil the soup? Would the neighbor lend a crust, or the fields yield anything at all? In many parts of medieval Europe, particularly among peasants, food was not a routine. It was a hope. Mornings began before the sun had risen, with a body already aching from the day before, and no promise of nourishment in sight. The air was damp, and the hearth had grown cold. Bread, if present, had likely hardened overnight, its rough crust turning into something that could break a tooth before easing the pangs of hunger. Imagine the silence of a kitchen with nothing to prepare. No scent of spices or fat, just the scratching of a wooden spoon against the bottom of an empty pot. A mother might stand there, looking down, praying in her own quiet way that something, anything, might come. A handful of oats, a bruised apple, even the leftovers from someone else's table. There was no comfort in appetite. Hunger was the body's daily language, its first whisper and a final cry. In the countryside, meals were dictated by the land's cruelty and kindness, by whether the frost came early or the rains came at all. The soil could give, but it could just as easily take back. A good season was a gift. A bad one could become a death sentence whispered across many homes. Now, picture two households in the same village. One, a stone manor with windows of glass and meats spitted over an open fire. The other, a mud brick dwelling, its roof patched with straw, its floor damp and cold, its table empty. This was the medieval paradox. Wealth and want separated not by great distance, but often just a walk through the fields. The noble might feast with guests, drinking wine while music played. Just a few paces away, a laborer might chew a crust of rye, gnawed thin by weevils, washing it down with water fetched from a well green with algae. The contrast wasn't accidental. It was part of the very fabric of medieval society. The more food the elite displayed, the more visible their power. Banquets served not only as nourishment, but as performance. Their extravagance was meant to be seen even by those who would never taste its flavors. Meanwhile, the peasants' hunger remained unseen, unspoken, woven into every muscle, every prayer. Even in times of modest harvests, inequality ensured that the burdens were not shared. While a lord's granary might be full, the people working his lands often went without. Sharing was rare, charity even rarer. Food, like land and breath, was a privilege. And yet, life went on. People adapted. They learned to stretch broth with wild herbs, to turn ground bark into flour. They learned to wait. Hunger taught patience, taught silence. It carved out routines marked by absence. No breakfast, a midday porridge if lucky. Supper, only sometimes. And in that long waiting, there was a kind of invisible courage, the courage to wake, to walk, to work, to care for others, when your own stomach turned on itself. That, too, is history. Not only the wars and kings and cathedrals, but the hands that stirred empty pots, the mothers who gave their portion to the youngest child, the old men who chose silence over complaint. They left little behind, no books, no portraits, no records of their meals. But they lived, and in their living they carried forward a quiet resilience that shaped the very heartbeat of their age. Tonight we begin to hear them. Their hunger was not just physical, it was spiritual, emotional, existential. A hunger for peace, for fairness, for enough. And though history did not record their names, their silences still echo in every empty plate, in every unfinished prayer. Let this chapter hold space for their stories, the ones who chewed slowly, stretched meals thin, and greeted each new day, not with fullness, but with the determined grace of those who knew what it meant to be truly empty. There are sounds in history that go unheard, the soft cracking of barley under a millstone, the rhythmic scrape of wooden paddles stirring grain into thick dough, the hush of breath held as the first loaves rise from clay ovens. But none was more persistent in medieval memory than the hunger-driven echo of bread. In the medieval world, bread was not just food. It was symbol, measure, and obsession. It was the boundary between nourishment and collapse, the crust that marked the edge of survival. To speak of bread in the Middle Ages is to speak of everything, of harvest, of labor, of inequality, of faith, and of fear. Everything revolved around wheat. Fields were plowed, prayers were said, taxes were calculated, and punishments were rendered based on grain. The planting season was a ritual in itself, and when the wheat began to sprout, it was watched like a newborn, each stalk a promise, each field a fragile hope against the weight of hunger. But hope was never certain. Crops failed often. When they did, it wasn't merely inconvenience, it was devastation. Without grain, there was no bread. Without bread, there was no food. And without food, there was no life. This was not metaphor. This was reality, harsh, bitter, constant. Even in good times, the availability of bread marked the thin line between the classes. The poor ate dark bread, heavy, coarse, and mixed with husks or even ground beans. It was filling, but only barely. Its texture could grind down teeth, and its flavor often told stories of desperation. The rich, meanwhile, consumed white bread, softer, lighter, more refined. It was sifted to remove the bran and baked with care, not haste. This difference was more than culinary. It was political, spiritual, and social. A loaf could tell you who someone was, what they endured, and where they belonged. The bread on your table was a mirror of your place in the world. And when the rich flaunted their golden loaves, it was not just a taste of comfort, it was a message, a silent pronouncement of status. The fear of bread running out was shared by all, but most heavily by the poor. Entire communities lived under the shadow of this fear. In towns and villages, rumors of rising grain prices or spoiled harvests spread faster than fire. Women would line up before dawn at the baker's stall, clutching coins or whatever could be traded. And if there was none left, they returned home with more silence, more hunger. There were times when bread riots erupted, not out of anger but of desperation. Crowds would seize carts or storm bakeries, not to steal, but to survive. These acts were not seen as crimes by those who committed them. They were prayers made visible. In the dim corners of chapels, people knelt and whispered to saints, not for wealth or peace, but for bread, for flour that would last until the next market day, for ovens that would not stay cold, for stomachs that would not cry out during the night. And yet, even in such scarcity, the idea of bread remained sacred. It was not simply food, it was blessing. In religious ritual, the Eucharist transformed bread into the divine. In daily life, mothers broke loaves with reverence. Children learned early to never waste a crumb. Every bit mattered. Every crust was cherished. Bread was not just eaten, it was carried, hidden, divided, and mourned. When famine came, people remembered the shape and scent of loaves they no longer had. When death visited, the dead were buried with prayers of bread. And when joy briefly returned, it was often marked not with gold, but with a shared piece of warm, fresh dough. This obsession with bread was not irrational. It was survival. It was knowing, generation after generation, that life rested in a basket, in an oven, in a grain. And so, as we continue to drift deeper into the lives of those who came before us, imagine the weight of that obsession. Imagine hunger so familiar that its shape resembled a loaf. Imagine a world where one word, po, carried the fullness of desire, the memory of scarcity, and the enduring will to live. Let us now drift deeper into the harsher corners of medieval hunger, a place beyond scarcity, a season of desperation. The world loses its familiar forms of sustenance, and survival becomes an act of quiet ingenuity and silent suffering. Food is no longer chosen, but found, and the body learns to digest what the land barely gives. When the harvest failed, when the last sack of grain was emptied, and the root cellar held nothing but shadows, people turned to what remained. And what remained was not food, as we understand it, but fragments of the world around them, the bark from trees, the dry ends of straw. The mold that crept over stale bread and clung like moss to the stones of forgotten storage huts. This was not innovation, it was necessity. The kitchen became a space of uneasy creativity. In place of flour, people ground acorns, bark, or dried nettles. They crushed the husks of seeds or scavenged whatever could be boiled into broth. Pala, straw, was chopped into small pieces and stirred into thin soups. Tree bark was dried, pounded, and sifted, becoming a kind of flour that darkened loaves and stiffened stomachs. Sometimes moss scraped from stones or tree trunks was added to these mixtures, adding texture, bitterness, and the faintest memory of the forests from which it came. The taste of these substitutes was often bitter, sour, or metallic. But taste was not a concern. What mattered was mass, weight, the sensation of something in the belly, anything to quiet the cramps. And yet, the body paid a price. Eating moldy grains could bring hallucinations, fever, even death. Ergot, a fungus that grew on rye, caused tremors and visions. Some who consumed it shook uncontrollably, their limbs curling as if in prayer, eyes glazed with agony. Children cried through nights of pain. Elders fell into delirium. The bread that once gave life now offered only suffering. There are scattered accounts of these afflictions, hidden in letters and monastery logs, tales of whole villages stumbling under the spell of poisoned grain, of priests misreading the symptoms as possession, as punishment from God. But it was not the divine, it was rot. It was hunger's cruel disguise. Even when the food was not tainted, the replacement ingredients wore down the body. Straw shredded the lining of the gut. Bark, indigestible in large amounts, brought on cramping and malnourishment. Without the balance of proteins, vitamins, and clean water, the body weakened further with each bite. Malnutrition turned skin to parchment. It dulled the eyes, thinned the hair, made every step feel like a weight had been tied to one's limbs, and yet still, people ate. Because not eating meant something worse. They sat on cold floors around cracked bowls and ate what their ancestors never imagined as food. And in doing so, they showed a kind of dignity that has too often gone unspoken. the dignity of survival, the strength it takes to chew what should not be chewed, to swallow pain in the name of life. This hunger was not dramatic. It did not roar. It whispered. It crept. It shaped the days with fatigue and the nights with restless sleep. It made the skin pale and the limbs slow. It hollowed out cheeks and eyes, but not the will to live. Women, often the ones who prepared these mixtures, carried the knowledge of how to make the inedible less harmful. They boiled the bark longer. They soaked the straw. They learned to read the signs of bad grain, and in their hands even the worst became a kind of bitter offering. Recipes were passed in murmurs, not for taste, but for safety. Boil the bark twice. Scrape the mold and soak the bread. Never eat grain that smells sweet. Children learned early to watch their mothers' faces as they cooked, the frown that meant something was wrong, the pause before tasting, the soft sigh of relief when no sickness followed. These quiet rituals became a language of survival. A family might sit in silence as they ate, not from lack of love, but from the shared weight of what they were eating. They knew what it meant. They felt it in their bones. And always, there was the waiting. For a letter from a distant cousin bringing news of food. For the return of a father who went to seek grain in a neighboring town. For the first green shoots of spring. Hunger sharpened time, made every day longer, made every night stretch wider, and yet they waited, because waiting too was survival. So imagine a long winter's night in a cottage without warmth, the wind howling through cracks, a child coughing in the dark, and in a pot over low coals a bitter broth made of leaves and memories. A mother stirs slowly, offering what she can. She does not expect thanks. She expects survival. These meals did not fill, they did not nourish. But they carried people through the long dark one spoonful at a time. Let us remember them. Not for the flavor of their meals, but for the strength in their silence. For the courage it took to eat what was never meant to be eaten. For the hands that scraped moss from bark. For the eyes that scanned forests not for beauty but for roots. For the bodies that bore hunger not as a moment, but as a season, a rhythm, a life. There were years when the soil gave nothing, when the skies refused to weep or wept too much, flooding hope beneath inches of water. These were not extraordinary times. They were expected, feared, whispered about across generations. The medieval world lived not with the possibility of famine, but with its certainty. The hunger did not always announce itself in thunder. It crept in slowly, month by month. First in the rumors carried by travelers from other villages, then in the nervous silence of the marketplace. And finally, in the empty baskets returning from the fields. The calendar marked more than saints and holy days. It marked the arrival of hunger. In spring, hope stirred with the sowing of seeds. Summer brought hard labor under the sun, backs bent and hands blistered. But it was autumn that revealed the truth. The harvest, if it was poor, a quiet dread settled in, a knowledge that the months ahead would be long, thin, and cold. Winter did not bring hunger. It revealed it. For many, the real famine began in late autumn, once the last crops had been taken in, when the stores were counted and found lacking, when the roots in the cellar grew soft with rot, when the flour sacks felt too light. Hunger came before the snow, and it lingered long after the thaw. By midwinter, the signs were visible. Children grew quieter, faces thinned. Fires burned with less vigor, not only from lack of wood, but from lack of strength to feed them. A mother might stir a pot of boiling water, hoping to coax some warmth into her children's bellies. A father might walk miles on brittle legs in search of anything to bring home. The fields, once places of work, became places of mourning. Crops that had failed stood as reminders. Wilted stalks, empty pods, cracked soil. Even the animals felt it. Chickens stopped laying. Goats gave less milk. The hunger was everywhere. It moved through the air, the ground, the blood. Some winters were named for their hunger: the year of no barley, the cold month of bitter bread, the long snow. These names passed from mouth to mouth, from old to young, not as stories, but as warnings, as memories carved into the rhythm of rural life. In towns, hunger moved differently. There were bakeries and markets, but prices rose sharply when grain was scarce. Bread became a luxury. Soup thinned until it became water. The poor huddled near the doors of churches, hoping for charity that might not come. Bakers locked their ovens. Merchants hoarded their grain. Hunger in these places had a price tag, and yet silence prevailed. Hunger was often hidden, wrapped in shame. To admit you had nothing was to admit weakness. People went without rather than beg. They shared what little they had, even when it meant less for themselves. A crust split between siblings, a spoon passed carefully from hand to hand. The church calendar dictated fasting days, but for many, every day was a fast. The rules of abstinence felt cruelly ironic to those who had nothing to abstain from. While sermons reminded the faithful to embrace humility and restraint, the empty bellies in the pews needed no such reminder. Priests preached moderation. The poor practiced it unwillingly and without end. This silence, this acceptance, was perhaps the most painful part. There were no uprisings in the snow, no marches in the mud. Only quiet, only endurance, only the long waiting for spring. And when spring finally came, it brought no guarantee. Some seeds failed to sprout, some rains came too hard, the threat never truly left. Each year carried within it the memory of the last, a memory that shaped every decision, every harvest, every prayer. Families developed rituals of preparation and restraint. Grain was counted by hand, each kernel a measure of time. Dried herbs were layered in jars with reverence, not as seasoning, but as sustenance. Cellars were checked daily. Walls were lined with what little could be preserved. The breath of winter was always felt, even in summer. Children were taught to look at the sky not with wonder, but calculation. Was that cloud a sign of rain? Would the frost come early? They learned to read the land, to sense the weight of the air. They learned to feel hunger not as an exception, but as the slow rhythm of life. The calendar of the medieval peasant was not only written in ink, but in ache, in longing, in hunger that returned again and again, as predictably as the turning of the year. Every month bore its burden. January was the month of thin stews. February brought brittle bread. March whispered of hope. April, the cruelest of promises. Still, they endured. Their survival was not marked by triumph, but by patience, not by feast, but by silence. Not by celebration, but by breath drawn in and let out one more time. The medieval year turned slowly, and with it, so did the wheel of hunger. In the landscape of medieval Europe, the manor stood like a silent sentinel over the land. High upon its rise, surrounded by stone walls and fields arranged like a patchwork quilt, the lord's estate seemed, from a distance, a place of order and protection. Below, scattered across the countryside, humble cottages clung to the earth like moss, their thatched roofs bowed from rain and time. Between these two worlds stretched an invisible thread of duty and dependence, woven tightly into the fabric of feudal life. The peasant gave labor. The lord offered protection. At least this was the promise. But promises are not always kept, and protection was often a word that grew thinner with hunger. To live under feudalism was to be bound. Not only by duty or oaths, but by the slow rhythm of a life in which one's labor was never entirely one's own. A portion of every harvest went to the Lord, regardless of how poor the yield. a portion of every animal, every barrel of wine, every sheaf of wheat. Even in the harshest of years, the demand remained. And when the fields failed to give, it was not the manna that went without. In theory, the Lord was to offer more than taxes. He was the guardian of his people, responsible for their safety, for justice, for the stewardship of land. In some places, in some seasons, this held true. There were lords who walked among their laborers, who forgave debts in hard years, who opened their stores in times of hunger, but these were rare. Their generosity remembered because it was not expected. More often, protection took the form of distance. The manor watched, but did not intervene. From behind thick walls and heavy doors, it received tribute, but returned little. In times of war, soldiers were summoned. In times of plague, the gates closed. In times of hunger, silence reigned. The granaries of the Lord were full when the bowls of the peasant were empty. In the dead of winter, when the earth had hardened and the frost clung to every stone, a laborer might pass the storage barns and hear the soft rustle of wheat inside, grain kept not for need, but for control. Food was power, and power was not shared. Some lords hoarded their stores to sell them at high prices when hunger became widespread. Others kept their reserves untouched, fearing scarcity for their own households. And some confiscated even more during lean years, enforcing their rights with iron. The contract of protection under such weight became brittle. It is told in hushed stories that women would kneel before the manor gates, asking for scraps, that fathers traded their tools for bread, that old men gave up their rations so the young might live another week. These were not acts of charity requested. They were quiet negotiations with power, made beneath banners that once swore safety. The church blessed the order of this world, preaching that each should remain in their place, that the noble ruled by divine right, and the peasant toiled in humble service. Hunger was painted not as injustice, but as spiritual test, a trial to be endured, a path to grace. And so, in silence, people endured. They did not rise up. They bent lower, bent beneath the weight of taxes, of hunger, of hope misplaced. Year after year, they returned to the same fields, planted the same seeds, gave the same share. Their lives passed without change, their loyalty steady, even as their trust thinned. The manor stood unchanged. Its stones did not feel the seasons. Its halls did not echo with empty bellies. And when the peasant died, his name was not written. Only his duty was remembered. The next hand took the same tool. The next child learned the same silence. There were no ledgers kept for what was lost, no song sung for what was given without return. But the earth remembered. The paths worn bare between cottage and field, the wells dug deeper each year, the bones buried with more prayer than food. And in that quiet remembering, a truth settles like dust on the hearth. The feudal bond was not a shield, but a tether. It held the poor to a promise that served another's comfort. And when the famine came, it was not the rope that broke. It was the body at its end. In a world where every crumb mattered, where the bowl was often half empty and the pot barely warm, withholding food became more than an accident of scarcity. It became a weapon, a quiet, effective means of control. In the medieval world, hunger was not only a condition of poverty or a failure of harvests. It was also a tool deliberately sharpened by those in positions of power. To be denied food was to be reminded of one's place. It was to feel, in the most physical way, the distance between those who commanded and those who obeyed. In households, monasteries, schools, and courts, food was used not to nourish, but to discipline. Within the cloistered walls of the monastery, silence reigned, and so did order. Meals were governed by ritual. Bells marked their beginning. prayers their end. But beyond the appearance of routine lay a deeper structure of control. Monks who disobeyed, who spoke out of turn or questioned the rules, could find themselves punished with fasting, not spiritual fasting, but enforced hunger, days without bread, nights with only water. The Church taught that discipline of the flesh brought one closer to holiness. To suffer hunger was to refine the soul. But what began as spiritual practice easily became punishment. A young novice, unable to memorize a verse, might be sent to bed without supper. An old brother, slow in his duties, might see his portion halved. The sacred fast became indistinguishable from the punitive one. In noble households, the same logic prevailed. Servants could be punished by denial of meals. Children, even of noble birth, were taught obedience through their stomachs. A meal withdrawn was a lesson taught without words. Hunger, in this sense, became language, a sharp and quiet grammar of control. In village life, among the poor where meals were already sparse, this dynamic took on even darker tones. Fathers, hardened by their own hunger, withheld food as correction. Wives, blamed for bad harvests or barren tables, received less than their share. Children learned early that love could be measured in slices and spoons. Stories whispered of schools where boys were made to fast for disobedience, or of orphanages where the weak were fed last. In these places, food was not a right, but a reward. To be fed was to be favored. To go without was to be forgotten. Even the justice system embraced this logic. In prisons, meals were determined not by need, but by punishment. Thieves might receive only bread and water. Heretics, sometimes less. The hunger imposed by the law was meant to correct, to cleanse, to humiliate. Hunger made the body obedient. It weakened the spirit. It slowed the tongue. A starving man rarely protests. A starving child learns not to ask. And so the denial of food became a method of shaping behavior, quietly, efficiently, invisibly. And yet, those who used hunger as punishment often forgot one thing: the body remembers. The stomach remembers the nights it went empty. The hands remember the trembling. The eyes remember the way the world dimmed. And even if the mouth remained silent, the memory endured. The legacy of these punishments was passed down, not in books, but in gestures, in the way a mother served her children first, in the way a grandfather hoarded crusts, in the fear generations later of wasting a single grain. Not all pain leaves scars on the skin. Some settles deeper in the marrow, in the rituals of everyday life, the decision to eat slowly, the habit of saving the last bite. The quiet shame of leaving the table hungry. This was not the hunger of famine. It was the hunger of control, the hunger that came with rules, with silence, with judgment. And its echo lingers still in places where food remains a privilege and fullness a form of permission. Let us remember not only the absence of food, but the intention behind that absence. For in that space, we glimpse the quiet cruelty of a world that knew how to use hunger, not only as consequence, but as command. The smell of roasted meat, rich and smoky, rarely drifted into the homes of the poor. In the medieval world, meat was not simply sustenance. It was status. It was ceremony. It was the province of those who held power and land. To eat meat regularly was to belong to a different world, a world of stone halls, silver platters, and endless firewood. For most people, meat was a memory, a rare indulgence, a fading dream of feast days and celebrations. A luxury that belonged more to the imagination than to the plate. The laws that governed the forests and the animals within them made sure of that. Game belonged to the lords, the deer, the boars, the rabbits. They were not wild but owned. To hunt them without permission was not a crime of hunger, but a crime against property. In many places, the forests were watched more closely than the people. A man caught poaching could be fined, mutilated, even killed. It mattered little that his children cried at night from hunger. The deer was not for them. The wild belonged to those who had fences and seals, not to those who had need. And so, the poor turned to what remained. Rats sometimes. Dogs when desperation gave no room for sentiment. Birds too small to satisfy, or fish from polluted streams. Meat that was already dying, that smelled wrong, that carried sickness. They cooked it anyway, masking the odor with vinegar or herbs, praying the heat would purify what the cold had corrupted. A rabbit caught in a snare might feed a family for 2 days. A bird, barely more than a mouthful, was still a gift. They used every part, the bones for broth, the fat for candles. Nothing was wasted, not out of virtue, but out of desperation. There were days set aside for meat, just as there were days where it was forbidden. The church dictated much of the dietary calendar. Fridays, Lent, and other holy days turned tables into rituals of absence. But for those who had little, the difference between a fast and an ordinary day was almost invisible. When meat was absent every day, the command to abstain rang hollow. The theology of fasting lost its meaning among the already starving. In noble households, meat was abundance. Roasted fowl stuffed with fruit, pork glazed with honey, legs of lamb garnished with rosemary. The meals were not only for eating, but for watching. Servants carried in trays while musicians played. The scent of the feast was meant to linger, to impress, to remind all present of the distance between wealth and want. A roasted swan, presented whole with its feathers, might grace the table. A boar's head, decorated with citrus and herbs, would symbolize the grandeur of the house. The bones discarded from those tables sometimes found their way into peasant stews. Scraps carried out by kitchen boys, or stolen by those brave enough to slip past the manor walls. These fragments of privilege were boiled for hours, yielding broths thin in substance, but rich in meaning. The poor learned to season with bones to draw nourishment from what had already been claimed. Meat was not only nourishment, it was power. To eat it was to be strong. To be strong was to rule. This belief ran deep. The flesh of animals became a metaphor for masculinity, for dominance, for divine favor. The poor, eating roots and porridge, were kept not only physically weaker, but symbolically smaller. Their bodies thinner, their voices softer, their presence more easily ignored. Children in the countryside could live entire seasons without tasting meat. When they finally did, perhaps at a festival or a neighbor's wedding, it was an event, the texture, the flavor, the warmth. They would remember it for years. Some would speak of it as their only true meal. A sliver of pork could be passed from hand to hand like treasure. A strip of dried meat might be saved, tasted only in slivers. Hunger shaped their senses. It taught reverence for flavor, for fat, for warmth. And still they endured, their hunger constant, their diets plain, but their rituals rich in meaning. A stew with meat was shared with ceremony. A feast day, no matter how modest, became a story retold. Even the animals they could not eat became part of the narrative. The pig raised for years, only to be slaughtered with reverence. The cow that gave milk, and eventually gave its life. These were not just animals, they were companions in survival. Meat, so often seen as simple food, became a marker of division, a quiet emblem of who was allowed to thrive and who was left to wait, to watch, to chew slowly on bread soaked in water, imagining something more. Even now, in paintings and manuscripts, the presence of meat tells us who mattered, who was painted full, who was remembered at table, and who was not. History often preserves the grand, the battles, the coronations, the sermons. But sometimes what is most telling is what lingers in the background. In the shadows of illuminated manuscripts and the margins of ancient chronicles, we catch faint glimpses of the everyday suffering that marked medieval lives. Suffering that wore no armor, carried no banners, and left no triumphant echo. Suffering that showed itself not in words, but in bodies. To look closely at a medieval painting is to see hunger rendered in delicate brush strokes. A child's face with sunken cheeks, eyes too large for a thin skull, lips that seem almost faded, drawn with hesitant pigment. In frescoes and altarpieces, the saints are radiant, the kings adorned, the angels floating. But in the background, among the kneeling supplicants or along the edges of the village scene, the hungry make their quiet appearance. Desnutrition was not named in the texts. It was not diagnosed, not charted, but it was seen. Chroniclers might mention pale complexions, trembling hands, wounds that refused to heal. Monastic records note frequent fainting, slow movements, inexplicable deaths among the lay brothers or children at the abbey. These descriptions, written in the language of faith or mystery, were often symptoms of a deeper lack. Hunger reshaped the human form slowly. It thinned the limbs until they became fragile like reeds. It drew the skin tight across the ribcage, created hollows where softness once was. In children, it arrested growth. In the elderly, it took away strength and breath alike. The signs were everywhere, and yet they passed unnoticed, accepted as part of life, or interpreted as divine punishment. One can imagine the scene inside a modest home. A boy sits cross-legged on the dirt floor, eating a crust of bread. His fingers are stained, his knees too large for his legs. A mother watches from the hearth, her own bowl untouched. Her hands are calloused, her expression distant. The room is silent except for the sound of chewing, of breathing, of enduring. This is the portrait that rarely reached parchment or canvas, yet lived in countless cottages. In the margins of illuminated books, artists sometimes doodled grotesques, figures with exaggerated features, emaciated limbs, or distended bellies. Scholars debate whether these were playful, cautionary, or reflections of real forms seen too often. The line between metaphor and memory blurs. Did the monk painting those figures recall the boy he saw collapse in the fields? The girl whose hair fell away in clumps before spring came? Bloodletting records from monasteries reveal another layer. Monks who were too weak to withstand the procedure, brothers whose blood ran thin. These were not merely medical curiosities, they were physical testimonies to the toll of poor diets, of endless fasting, of food that never satisfied. The body, robbed slowly of what it needed, became the parchment upon which hunger was written. Even in the writings of physicians and herbalists, there are veiled glimpses. Remedies for pale skin, for dizziness, for swollen gums. Potions to ease aching bones or to stop the fainting spells of children. These are not just signs of illness, they are signs of lack, of meals missed, of nutrients denied. The paintings that survive, the manuscripts that remain, speak in whispers. They do not scream famine. They suggest it. A gray tone in the face, a limp hand, eyes that look but do not shine. These are the images of hunger that history did not seek to preserve, yet could not avoid. And so we look now, centuries later, at these fragments and begin to see the outlines of a truth too long hidden. Hunger does not always speak, but it always leaves traces. In the posture of a woman seated too still, in the bent back of a child carrying water, in the missing teeth, the swollen joints, the absent glow of health. These were not the rare or the damned. They were the many, the forgotten. The background of every royal portrait, every liturgical scene. Their hunger is part of the landscape, woven into the very pigments of history. And though they did not leave their names, they left their shadows. quiet and enduring. In the medieval world, the table was more than a place of nourishment. It was a space shaped by doctrine, discipline, and divine order. To eat was never a simple act. Every bite, every absence, every fast was woven with the threads of belief. The church, vast and powerful, extended its hand not only into the soul, but into the stomach. Food was sacred, and therefore it was controlled. The calendar of the faithful was crowded not only with feast days, but with days of abstention, Fridays without flesh, the 40 long days of Lent, vigils before holy celebrations, Advent, Ember Days, Rogation Days. Each brought rules that governed the table. Meat was forbidden, dairy restricted, eggs withheld. The rhythm of eating was dictated not by appetite or harvest, but by holy time. The faithful obeyed, whether from conviction or necessity. For the rich, these periods became opportunities to display religious devotion through elaborate substitutes, fish pies glazed with spices, almond milk molded to mimic cream, eels wrapped in gold leaf. Abstinence transformed into spectacle. Tables remained full, only their content altered. But for the poor, these rules were less a shift and more a continuation. A day without meat was no different from the day before. Cheese was already rare, butter a luxury. Fish, if not caught by hand, might be unreachable. The fast was perpetual, whether ordained or not. Still, the command remained. To eat outside the rules was not only to err, it was to sin. It placed the soul in danger. The meal became confession, the plate a testimony. The hungry were watched. The meals of monasteries, of villages, of cities were observed and sometimes reported. Priests reminded the faithful that the mouth could condemn as easily as the mind. Within cloisters, the rules grew stricter. Meals in silence, tables where one read scripture while the others ate. No conversation, only chewing and prayer. On certain days, only bread and water. Monks recorded these rituals meticulously. One slice, one bowl, one sip. In homes, children were taught to bless their food to recognize its presence as grace. But they also learned fear, the fear of eating the wrong thing at the wrong time, the fear of indulgence, the fear of desire. Appetite became suspect, fullness a danger. Women, especially, bore the burden of this doctrine. Charged with preparing meals, they carried the knowledge of when, what, and how to serve. A mistake could be seen as spiritual failure, a meal too rich, a taste too soon. The kitchen became a sanctuary, but also a confessional. There were also stories, half whispers, barely written, of those who could not follow the rules, the weak, the ill, the desperate, a man who broke the fast in secret, a mother who fed her children meat during Lent, a traveler who forgot the holy day. Their shame was quiet but lasting, and yet hunger, real hunger, paid no mind to doctrine. The stomach did not understand the liturgical year. It growled on Good Friday. It ached through Lent. It asked endlessly for something more. And so the faithful struggled between obedience and need, between salvation and survival. The church taught that discipline of the flesh brought one closer to God, that to suffer hunger was to grow in holiness. But for many that suffering was not chosen, it was inherited, it was lived. So the people prayed with empty hands, they lit candles beside empty bowls, they knelt with tired limbs and hollow eyes. They obeyed not because they could, but because they must. Even now, in the margins of old missals, we see small drawings of tables, of fish on plates, of monks with folded hands, the memory of meals shaped by faith, the echo of hunger framed in piety. And in these traces, we sense the quiet tension between body and belief. a hunger that bowed not only the head, but the heart. In a world where the senses guided survival, trust was fragile, and food bore as much suspicion as solace. The medieval meal was not merely a means of nourishment, it was a moment of vulnerability. Hunger was omnipresent, but alongside it, like a quiet shadow, lingered fear. The fear that the next mouthful might bring not comfort, but sickness. Not strength, but silence. In royal courts, the fear of poison crept like ivy along the banquet hall walls. It clung to every goblet and glistened on each gilded plate. Monarchs and nobles, seated at long tables under vaulted ceilings, did not eat freely. They watched their food. They waited. They assigned trusted tasters, men whose lives were wagered with every bite. A pause, a swallow, a few moments of breath held in unison. Only then would the king dine. These precautions were not theatrics. Power in the medieval world was a game of bloodlines and betrayal. A poisoned chalice could succeed where armies had failed. And so the elite turned their kitchens into fortresses. Meals were prepared under supervision. Ingredients were tested. Sometimes food was blessed, passed through smoke, or handled only by sworn hands. But poison did not reside only in palaces. Among the poor, among monks and mothers, fear took a different shape, less political, more practical. Most food spoiled quickly. There was no refrigeration, no pasteurization. Salt, smoke, vinegar, and drying were the shields against rot, but they were not foolproof. Bread could be soft with mold, its green patches scraped away and the rest still eaten. Grain stored too long could grow invisible fungi. Milk curdled in heat. Meat turned sour within days. And yet, what choice was there? Hunger left little room for caution. People ate what they had. They listened to their bodies, watched for warning signs. The sweetness of rot, the sting of spoiled drink, the greasiness of old broth. If something tasted strange, it might be set aside. But more often, it was consumed anyway. Because the hunger never asked questions, it simply pressed, unrelenting. In the monasteries, where silence ruled and meals were taken in quiet procession, the dangers were no less. Shared bowls, communal loaves, and simple stews meant that contamination spread fast. Monastic records tell of sudden illnesses sweeping through entire brotherhoods. Stomachs twisted with pain, fevered visions mistaken for divine ecstasy, convulsions taken as possession. In truth, it may have been the ergot in the rye, the spoiled cream, the foul water drawn from a stagnant well. Even water, so essential, so taken for granted today, was perilous. Wells went stagnant, rivers carried filth, rain barrels bred disease, fermentation became safety, light ales and weak wines were drunk not for celebration, but for survival. Children drank them, pregnant women drank them, not out of indulgence, but necessity. The alcohol, mild as it was, could ward off what the water welcomed. And still, sometimes it was not time, but malice that tainted food, bitter roots ground into sauces. Powders added to wine, herbs with subtle poisons indistinguishable from their healing cousins. In the courts, the fear of murder by meal never quite left the room. In towns, rumors spread of jealous bakers, angry neighbors, spurned lovers. A meal left at the door might be a gift or a grave. Utensils, too, carried danger. Pewter cups lined with lead, glazed ceramics leaching toxins, rotten wood that harbored sickness. Even the tools of nourishment held risk. Some claimed that silver would blacken when exposed to poison, a superstition that led to silver cutlery for the wealthy. But belief, like bread, did not always keep. And yet, despite it all, meals were shared. Bowls passed from hand to hand, loaves broken between friends, the fire crackled, Pots simmered, spoons stirred, because eating was more than survival. It was connection, it was tradition, it was courage. To eat in the medieval world was to trust, to hope, to endure. The body, vulnerable as it was, became resilient. It learned to suffer, it learned to recover, and when it could not, stories filled the gaps. Tales of saints who healed with touch, of devils who poisoned without warning, of neighbors who brought broth in the dark of night, not knowing whether it would heal or harm. Today, we read these histories with the comfort of distance. But the fear was real. It sat at every table, it lingered in every kitchen, and yet the people ate. They had to. Because even when food brought fear, it was still life, still warmth, still the hope of another day. And in that silent bravery, the medieval meal became something more than sustenance. It became survival, fragile, sacred, and always uncertain. In a quiet, fog-covered village in the heart of 14th century France, winter arrived early that year and stayed longer than anyone expected. Snow clung to the hillsides, dampening the soil, silencing the birds. The frost crept into cracks in the wood, into the joints of the elderly, into the dreams of children who knew what it meant when their bellies remained empty for days. In one small home near the edge of this village, a mother sat beside the hearth with her hands in her lap. Her fingers, calloused and dry from work and cold, rested over a coarse sack of grain, the last in the house. It had once been golden, a proud, modest harvest they had stored carefully, saved for moments just like this. But the storage shed had leaked in the rain, the sacks had grown damp, and now the kernels were darker, spotted, clumped together in the corners as if trying to hide their rot. She had hesitated for days. She had gone to neighbors. Few had anything more than she did. She had dug near the roots behind her cottage, hoping to find forgotten turnips or winter onions. She had watered broth to stretch it thinner, but now her son lay quiet on the straw bed, too tired to play, too tired to speak. He was only 7. His ribs showed through his tunic. His lips were pale. So she ground the grain. She spread it thin before the fire, hoping the heat would lift the smell. She whispered prayers as she worked, turning the stones over the seeds, adding herbs she barely remembered the names of. She mixed the flour with warm water, kneaded it into small, heavy rounds, and baked them on flat stones. The smell filled the room, not the sweet scent of bread, but something bitter, sour, still familiar. He ate half a cake. He smiled when he chewed. It had been days since his last real meal. She watched him as he ate, brushing his hair back, murmuring thanks. That night, he coughed in his sleep. By morning, he had begun to shake. His limbs twitched uncontrollably. His eyes rolled back, his mouth opened and closed without words. He whispered names no one recognized. He stared into the dark corners of the room and cried at things no one else could see. The healer came. She brought a poultice, some wine mixed with sage. She laid cloths over his forehead and murmured blessings. But she had seen this before, not often, but enough to know that it came from the grain, from the blackness that grew in it when the harvest was poor and the rain too constant. Ergot, though they did not call it by that name, had returned. The fungus invaded the grain invisibly. It spread like a silent fog, and when consumed, it poisoned the body from within. It burned the blood, unbalanced the mind, stiffened the limbs. Some called it fire in the bones, others believed it to be a test from God. Some whispered it was punishment for unknown sins. By evening, the boy screamed in pain. He clutched his stomach, curled into himself. His mother held him, her arms trembling, her eyes hollow. Her husband stood in the doorway, unable to speak. The younger children cried in silence. He died at dawn. His breath slowing, then stopping, as the sky above the village turned gray again. They buried him in a shallow grave near the church, where the soil was still soft. The priest said a few words. The villagers bowed their heads. No one asked where the bread had come from. No one needed to. That day, the mother sat by the hearth once more. The remaining bread still lay where he had left it. She could not touch it. She wrapped it in cloth, placed it in a wooden box, and buried it beneath a stone behind the house. She would never bake again without seeing his face, without feeling her own hands as threats, without smelling the sharp, bitter note of spoiled wheat in her dreams. In time, her other children grew. The seasons changed. But every winter, as the frost returned, so did the memory. It was a story not recorded in chronicles. No scribe inked it into parchment. But it passed through the years in whispers, among women who feared the dampness in their grain sacks, among healers who traced illness back to bread, among grandmothers who told children to smell the flour twice, to cut away the dark, to trust their hunger, but not always what answered it. This, too, was part of the medieval world, not the battles, not the crowns, but a child dying from bread, bread made in love, bread born of necessity. And a mother who carried that sorrow quietly for the rest of her life, because sometimes history is not made of the loudest moments. Sometimes it lives in the silence after the meal, in the empty seat by the fire, in the small grave by the stone wall, and in the hearts of those who remember. In the corner of countless medieval homes where the wind slipped through cracks and the cold clung to bones, there stood a single blackened pot. It was not polished, it was not elegant. It carried no decoration save the crust of soot that had formed through the years, and the smell, that unmistakable smell of survival that clung to its rim, to its sides, to the air itself. This pot was rarely empty. It rarely cooled. It lived over the fire like a second heart, beating softly with steam and patience. This was the eternal soup, the forever broth, a concoction that was never truly finished, never truly started. Its origins were forgotten, buried beneath layers of memory and necessity. Into this pot went everything: potato skins, carrot tops, tough outer leaves of cabbage, the last spoonfuls of yesterday's porridge, and the browned water from boiling grains. Every scrap, every peel, every unlikely offering was given over to the cauldron as though it could transform lack into life. It was a quiet alchemy, a theology of boiling and waiting. The act of feeding a family not with plenty, but with endurance. Children grew up watching this pot. They learned before they could walk the sound it made when stirred, the gentle swish, the soft clink of bones against iron. They learned that when the pot boiled, they might eat, and when it did not, they would wait. There were rules, though few were spoken. Never let the pot go dry. Stir it often, lest the bottom burn. Add something each day, even if it is only water and hope. Meat, if it ever appeared, changed the mood of the entire household. A bone with marrow could scent the room so deeply that even neighbors would pause as they passed the door. A single sausage transformed the broth for a week. The pot held more than food. It held time. Into it were dropped the worries of mothers, the fatigue of fathers, the illnesses of children, the prayers of the elderly. Each addition became part of a story no one told aloud, but everyone remembered. The soup changed daily. Sometimes thin as tea, other times thick as porridge. Some days gray and bitter, others golden with lentils and leeks. In some households it simmered day and night. Left by the fire, absorbing every ember's whisper, every sigh of the cook who tended it. It needed watching, but it also offered constancy. It promised something warm, if not always filling. Something shared even when nothing else could be. The soup carried within it the taste of poverty, but also the deep knowledge of community. A neighbor might pass by with a handful of herbs, a piece of dried meat, a few beans. not a gift, but a contribution. In return, they would dip a wooden spoon into the broth and taste the collective resilience of their village. When guests arrived, rare, but always hungry, a bowl would be ladled without question. When children returned from fields or streams, they would be greeted not with sweets, but with a cup of soup. When someone died, a bigger pot was borrowed, and the eternal soup became a communal meal, thickened with memories. Some said that this soup could heal, that a week of it could draw out a fever, that its warmth could lift sadness, that its steam, scented with garlic and thyme, could carry away bad dreams. These were not beliefs written in books. They were known in the bones. But there were risks. A pot neglected could turn, a sourness could creep in, unnoticed until it was too late. Food poisoning, though unnamed, was known. Children fell ill. Old men vomited through the night. The cause was guessed, rarely confirmed, and yet the pot returned to the fire. Because what choice was there? Food was not abundance. It was repetition. It was stretching. It was making do. And in that repetition, there was a strange kind of grace. The soup became a lesson in gratitude. A bowl that never overflowed but rarely disappeared. The pot itself often outlasted its makers. Passed from mother to daughter, from one generation to the next. Cracked but still serviceable. It knew secrets. It had boiled through births and deaths, through famine and harvest. It had heard lullabies and arguments, laughter and silence. No tapestry, no illuminated manuscript recorded the eternal soup. It was too humble, too ordinary. But it fed more lives than all the feasts in castles. It witnessed more truth than any royal decree. And in its slow simmer, in its quiet persistence, it told a story the world still needs to hear, that even in hunger there was love, that even in scarcity there was sharing, that even when everything else failed, the soup endured, a pot, a fire, a handful of scraps. This was the recipe for survival. And in that modest bowl of broth, steaming in the cold, was everything. In the folds of medieval silence, beneath the clang of bells and the drone of sermons, there was the rustle of footsteps not meant to be heard. Often barefoot, often trembling, women walked through market alleys or scaled fences in the dark, not to steal riches or ornaments, but to take what should have been theirs all along, food, a handful of barley, a loaf too stale for sale, a radish left behind on a wooden table. These were not crimes of greed. They were acts of desperation, of defiance, of love. Behind every theft lay a story of hunger, a face pale with fatigue, a child crying into the folds of a worn dress. Theft, even of food, was a sin. It was also a crime punishable by shame, imprisonment, lashes, or worse. Market vendors guarded their stalls with suspicion, sometimes with clubs. Manor stores were locked tight, guarded by men loyal to their lord, men with iron keys and sharper tempers. The lines between justice and cruelty were blurred by hierarchy and survival, and yet the women came. Often it was the mothers who stole, for the child with the swollen belly, for the infant too weak to cry. Sometimes it was the older sister, hair already graying at the temples from work and worry. Sometimes it was the grandmother, stooped from years of labor, her fingers still nimble enough to slip into baskets when backs were turned. There are fragments in court records, brief notations of punishment. A woman whipped in the village square for taking a slice of bread, another locked in the stocks, mocked as her children watched. Yet the punishments rarely stopped the hunger, nor the courage. In towns and cities, bakeries were watched closely. The scent of warm bread drifted into alleys where the poor lingered. A crust here, a burned corner there. Some bakers, when they could, looked the other way. Others were harsh, calling the guards, shouting curses. It depended on the day, the mood, the season. Sometimes these women planned together. They mapped the moments when markets were busiest, when guards turned to speak, when lanterns flickered low. They whispered strategies behind closed shutters, shared lookouts with neighbors, swapped warnings like recipes. But often it was impulse, the moment when a woman, dizzy with fatigue and grief, saw a chance and took it, her heart pounding. Her hands quick, her escape brief. Not all were caught. Some returned home, breathless but triumphant, clutching a heel of bread or a few dried beans. Their children ate quietly, knowing not to ask. Others were caught and made examples of. Their names became whispers, not in shame but in mourning. One mother in a southern village was imprisoned for stealing barley from a church storeroom. She had asked first, knelt before the priest, pleaded for her sick son. The priest had refused. She returned at night, desperate. She was caught. Her child died while she sat in a cold cell, her hands still smelling of grain. Some women never returned. Taken into the forests to escape the reach of law, they lived as shadows, gathering wild roots, bartering with outcasts. Their names were lost, but their survival lingered in the memory of other women who remembered their courage. This hunger was not individual, it was generational. It passed from mother to daughter, along with the knowledge of which trees bore the most bitter fruit, which weeds could be boiled into something like soup, which baker might give crumbs if asked on a kind day. To steal food was to gamble everything, but for many it was the only option left, the only way to resist the slow erasure that hunger brought, the only way to say, I will not let my children disappear. History remembers queens, saints, and warriors. But these women, fierce in silence, brave in rags, defiant in the name of love, lived lives of equal valor. Their battles were waged in alleyways, at market stalls, under the cover of night. They did not seek glory, they sought survival. And in the cracked bread they held close, in the bruised apples hidden beneath cloaks, in the broken nails and racing hearts, they carved out something that history often overlooks, the right to eat, the right to live, even if it meant risking everything. In the medieval world, hunger was not merely endured, it was woven into the fabric of life. It shaped not only the body, but belief. It informed morality, doctrine, and the rhythm of daily existence. Over time, hunger became normalized, not as a tragedy, but as a state of being, something expected, something almost sacred. Famine, when it came, was seen not just as a crisis, but as a visitation, a test, a punishment, a message from the divine. The absence of food was interpreted as a mirror of spiritual deficiency. The poor were told to endure their hunger with patience, humility, and gratitude, not to question, not to protest, to suffer in silence. Sermons preached from pulpits painted the empty stomach as a path to purity. Bishops compared the hunger of the body to the hunger of the soul. To deny the flesh, they said, was to draw closer to the divine. The full belly, they warned, was the beginning of sin. And so deprivation became virtue. For the ruling classes, hunger in the lower ranks was accepted as natural, even necessary. It preserved hierarchy. It reminded the hungry of their place. There was food in the manor halls, there was grain stored in the abbeys. But it was not for everyone. To feed the poor beyond their ration was, in some eyes, to disrupt the order of the world. The concept of a fome acceptable, an acceptable hunger, took root. A hunger that kept peasants lean, docile, and dependent, not dead, not rioting, but quiet, hollowed, just enough food to work the fields, to birth the children, to bury the dead. Anything more was indulgence. Families adjusted to this rhythm. Children learned to eat less, to chew slowly, to be grateful for broth made of bones already boiled 3 times. Women served their husbands and sons first, then scraped the pot for themselves. Men swallowed bitterness with their bread, measuring each bite with the knowledge of how much must be left for the next day. This normalization went deeper than hunger. It touched identity. The poor began to see their suffering as ordained, even righteous. They told stories of saints who starved in deserts, of martyrs who survived on crumbs. They repeated prayers that thanked God for every crust. They believed, because they had to, that their emptiness was holy, and the church affirmed it. In cathedrals where gold gleamed, priests reminded their flocks that hunger brought them closer to the suffering of Christ, that their fasts were offerings, that their pains would be rewarded in heaven. They were told to wear their thinness like a badge, to greet the rumble of their bellies with a bowed head. But beneath this acceptance, there were murmurs, stories passed in whispers, of villages where people boiled grass, of mothers who gave their last bread to children, then lay down to die. Of bodies buried without coffins, bones visible beneath torn cloth. Even in this world of sanctioned scarcity, the limits of silence cracked. In some seasons, the hunger grew too sharp. In some places, the famine swallowed too much. There were rebellions, there were thefts, there were nights when the baker's doors were broken open, but the system always tried to return, to reestablish the idea that suffering was a natural state. This is what history often forgets, not just the fact of hunger, but the way it was made invisible, the way it was moralized, the way people were taught to see their starvation not as injustice, but as destiny. The poor did not starve because there was no food. Often there was food, but it was hoarded, controlled, taxed, denied. The acceptable hunger was never acceptable to those who endured it, but their voices, thin with fatigue, rarely reached the parchment of scribes. Still, they endured. And in their endurance, a different truth lived, one that questioned the sermons, that resisted the shame, that whispered again and again, "Hunger is not holy, hunger is not just, it is only hunger, and no one should be asked to carry it forever." In the quiet corners of stone monasteries, where candlelight flickered on cool walls and footsteps echoed across cloisters, there existed a peculiar contradiction. The monastery, a place of refuge from the chaos of the outside world, was also a space of strict denial. It promised peace, but it demanded hunger. Monks entered the monastic life in search of salvation, of purpose, of divine proximity. In exchange, they gave up not only wealth and comfort, but the most human of comforts, food. The rule of Saint Benedict, followed by many monastic communities, outlined strict practices. Meals were to be simple. Flesh was to be avoided. Quantity was to be limited. Silence was to be observed. The refectory, where meals were taken, was a place of order and ritual. The monks sat on long wooden benches, their bowls of soup or porridge placed before them with care. No one spoke. Instead, one of them read aloud from Scripture or from the lives of saints, reminding the others that they were not there to enjoy, but to endure. Each bite was taken in contemplation, each swallow a moment of reflection. The meals were sparse. Bread often coarse and days old, broth thin and unseasoned, beans, lentils, occasionally turnips or leeks, water or weak ale. Salt was used sparingly. Oil was rationed. Butter, a rarity. Cheese, if available, was divided with precision. The portions were calculated, never generous. Fullness was not the goal, sustenance, nothing more. Yet within these limits, there was purpose. The monks believed that by denying the flesh, they could elevate the soul. That through hunger, they might draw closer to the suffering of Christ. That each grumble of the stomach was a reminder of their dependence on God, not on the world. Fasting was frequent, not only during Lent, but on many other holy days, vigils, and moments of penance. Some monks embraced extreme forms of denial, eating once a day or even less. Others flagellated themselves when tempted by hunger, seeing desire as sin. And still they prayed. They prayed with hands that trembled. They prayed with knees that ached. They prayed with mouths that tasted only simplicity. Outside the walls, peasants often imagined the monks well-fed. After all, monasteries had land, livestock, and granaries. But much of what was grown and stored was meant for trade, for tithes, or for the upkeep of the institution. The brothers lived by different rules. Their bodies, like their voices, were muted. Yet not all monasteries were equal. Some, especially those in wealthier regions, had more to offer. Their refectories served fish, fruits, even wine. But even there, the discipline remained. Food might be present, but indulgence was forbidden. The act of eating was wrapped in ritual, stripped of joy. Novices often struggled. They came from homes where hunger was known, but at least meals were shared with warmth. In the monastery, the hunger was colder, more deliberate. There was no laughter at the table, no conversation. Only the sound of spoons on wood, of scripture in the air, of silence pressing in from all sides. Some monks wrote of their temptations, of dreaming of meat, of waking in the night to nibble crumbs in secret, of weeping after breaking a fast too early. These confessions were not met with anger, but with correction. They were reminded of their vows, of the holy hunger they had chosen. But the body, fragile and persistent, did not always comply. Some monks grew weak, their limbs thinned, their skin dulled, their stomachs churned with the effort of digestion made too slow. Illness was common, recovery uncertain. In old age, some were allowed more, a softer diet, a warmer bowl. But by then appetite had faded. The body no longer asked. The soul had learned through decades of discipline to listen without desiring. The monastery was indeed a refuge, but not from suffering. Rather, it offered a reshaping of suffering into sanctity, a reframing of hunger into holiness. A place where the absence of flavor was seen not as loss, but as liberation. And so, behind those thick walls, among rows of bowed heads and silent meals, food became more than sustenance. It became a vow, a practice, a quiet prison that promised salvation, one spoonful at a time. In the medieval world, water was never simply water. It was a substance woven with contradictions, at once a symbol of life and purification, yet so often a carrier of death and decay. Though rain fell generously in many parts of Europe, and rivers carved their paths through towns and villages, the presence of water did not guarantee safety. It was abundant, yes, but rarely clean, rarely pure, and almost never trusted without reason. Most people lived close to water out of necessity. Rivers and streams offered not only hydration, but energy, irrigation, and transportation. Yet these same waters received waste from both humans and animals. Butchers washed their knives in the stream, laundresses beat stained linens against its rocks, children played along its banks, oblivious to what drifted beneath the surface. The concept of sanitation, as we understand it today, was foreign. Human waste was often emptied into the streets or into shallow pits, which then seeped into nearby wells. In growing towns, especially those with stone buildings and narrow alleys, runoff carried filth directly into water sources. The same bucket that drew water might be used to rinse chamber pots, to cool hot irons, or to clean muddy boots. And so, the very substance that should have sustained life became a silent conveyor of illness. Villagers knew this, even if they lacked the words to explain it. They spoke of cursed wells, of streams that turned after the death of livestock, of neighbors who fell ill after drinking from unfamiliar springs. They noticed patterns, fevers following rainfall, cramps after snowmelt. They learned to distrust the water that flowed too slowly or that tasted slightly of metal or rot. In monasteries and noble estates, more attention was given to water quality. Stone aqueducts, deep wells, and rudimentary filtration systems were used to separate the cleaner supply from the rest. Rainwater was caught in barrels and cisterns lined with smooth stone. But these systems required knowledge, labor, and above all, resources. Most peasants could not afford them. And so alternatives were born of both necessity and observation. Weak beer and ale became the norm, not for merriment, but because the brewing process boiled the water, killing many of its invisible threats. Even children barely walking were given watered beer or fermented drinks. It was the safer choice, the one that left fewer graves behind. The church played a strange role in this dance between thirst and safety. Holy water was sanctified, believed to hold healing properties. Springs near monasteries and chapels were often labeled as miraculous, blessed by saints, capable of curing sickness. Pilgrims traveled miles to drink from such places, cupping their hands in trembling reverence. Some returned healed, others did not. There were moments of collective memory that shaped entire regions, times when a well ran foul and half a village vanished. These traumas lingered not only in stories, but in behaviors passed down generations. Even centuries later, old women would warn their grandchildren to boil water from that stream, to never draw from that northern well. In times of siege or famine, the search for clean water became even more desperate. Wells were targeted, poisoned, covered. People resorted to collecting dew, to drinking from puddles, to squeezing moisture from roots. In castles under siege, the scarcity of water became a sentence of slow death. A dry cistern was more feared than an enemy at the gate. The taste of clean water, when found, was remembered like a miracle. Cold from the earth, clear, without the sting of iron or the bitterness of stagnation. It was a sensation so rare, so fleeting, that some described it in religious terms, as a blessing undeserved, a whisper of paradise. And always there was the labor. Carrying water was the work of women and children. Buckets drawn hand over hand from deep wells, pails balanced on shoulders over uneven paths. Arms sore from the weight, feet blistered from distance. The act of fetching water shaped the bodies and routines of entire households. It took time, it took strength, it took caution, because a misstep could mean more than a spill. It could mean a week of fever. It could mean the loss of a child. It could mean mourning without explanation. So much of medieval life was ruled by the unseen, spirits, saints, sins, sicknesses, and water, though visible, was among the most mysterious. Its clarity could deceive, its stillness could hide danger, its abundance could mock the dying. And still they drank, because there was no choice, because thirst came every day. And in that simple act of dipping a ladle, of swallowing carefully, of hoping, praying, remembering, was all the fragile dignity of survival. Long before mirrors were common, before dental tools existed in the hands of ordinary people, the mouth told a story all its own. It whispered of hardship, scarcity, and silent suffering. In medieval Europe, teeth were not merely bones for chewing. They were quiet records of deprivation, etched with each bite of rough bread and every sip of acidic broth. The poor, who made up the overwhelming majority of the population, were often marked by their mouths. Children's smiles showed gaps, not from the natural loss of baby teeth, but from decay so advanced it left black stumps and exposed roots. Their gums swelled and bled, red and raw from infections that festered without treatment. The ache of a tooth gone bad was a familiar pain, often ignored until it grew unbearable. Bread, the most basic food for centuries, was both salvation and saboteur. For the privileged, it was soft and white, made with sifted flour and baked in clean ovens, but for the poor, it was often dark, dense, and harsh. The flour was coarse, sometimes mixed with barley, rye, or even ground acorns. When times were truly dire, straw sawdust and ground nutshells were added to stretch the dough, abrasive fillers that shredded enamel with each bite. This bread hardened quickly, and without the modern means of preservation, it often turned to stone within a day. It had to be soaked in soup or beer to be made edible again. Yet, even when softened, it left its mark. The repeated act of grinding it down wore teeth flat. Molars fractured, front teeth loosened. Biting became an act of endurance. Meat, if it ever graced the table, was usually tough and stringy. It was boiled for hours to make it chewable, but the strain it placed on already weakened teeth remained. And sweets, though rare among the poor, appeared now and then in the form of fermented fruit, wild honey, or the occasional pastry shared at a feast. These indulgences, when encountered, worsened decay already well underway. There was no toothpaste, no toothbrush. At best, people chewed on sticks to clean their mouths, or rinsed with salt water or vinegar. Some rubbed their gums with cloth. But for many, oral hygiene was a concept as distant as the stars. They lived with pain until it became background noise. A constant throb, a sting at every meal. The result was that by adulthood, many peasants had lost several teeth. Others had mouths riddled with abscesses, their breath sharp with infection. Chewing became a task performed with the few teeth that remained, or with the side of the tongue, or with the gums alone. The face adapted, the jaw shifted, speech slurred. This was not just a medical issue, it was social. In a world where appearance marked one's class and role, the mouth was a signpost. A missing tooth was a symbol of hardship, a rotted smile, a badge of poverty. Among the nobility, where sugar was becoming a delicacy, tooth decay also appeared, but it was hidden, treated, extracted. Among the poor, it was lived. And it was endured. Midwives learned to recognize infants too weak to suckle due to oral infections. Laborers often worked while clutching their jaws, driven to nausea by pain. Women in particular suffered in silence, their complaints dismissed, their discomfort normalized. A toothache could linger for months, growing worse until the jaw swelled, the fever spiked, and death followed without explanation. In some villages, there were individuals known for pulling teeth, not healers, but brave souls with strong hands and knives. There was no anesthesia, no antiseptic, a stick to bite, a friend to hold one's shoulders, a scream. And then silence, sometimes relief, sometimes bleeding that never stopped. And still life continued. Meals were chewed slowly. Speech adapted, smiles grew guarded, faces aged before their time. Art from the period rarely showed this. Saints and kings had perfect mouths. But in back rooms and mud houses, the real faces of medieval life bore a different truth. They bore mouths broken by survival, by the bread that saved and scarred, by the hunger that forced them to eat what they could, by the years of silence around the pain. The teeth of the poor did not sparkle. They told stories instead. Of what it meant to live on the edge of nourishment, of what it meant to chew through poverty day by day, and of how even the smallest part of the body carries the weight of history. In the dim cottages scattered across medieval fields, the boundary between hunger and illness was barely perceptible. It was not that one caused the other in a linear path, but rather that they clung to each other, like shadows under the same sun, indistinguishable, in their effect on the body and the soul. A body starved of nourishment became a fragile husk, susceptible to the smallest wounds, the gentlest breeze, the barest touch of cold. Each morning began with the same ritual, hoping that today, perhaps, would not bring more of the same. But hunger, when it was a companion for weeks, months, and years, settled into the body like a second skin. It slowed everything: the breath, the blink of the eye, the pace of thought. Children no longer ran. They sat, heads heavy, legs too weak to chase each other around the fire. Women moved like smoke, quiet and languid, their backs curved not only from work but from fatigue that never lifted. When disease entered such a space, it did not announce itself loudly. It crept. A cough, a shiver, a pale cheek. These signs were so common as to almost be ignored. But beneath them, the slow erosion of life began. The body that had not known meat in months, that had not tasted fat or fresh greens, that had endured winter after winter on barley and broth, no longer knew how to fight. Even the smallest wounds, blisters from shoes, scrapes from branches, bites from rats, could fester, turning red, then purple, then black. Swollen joints and swollen faces marked the passing days. Pus and blood became familiar sights. Mothers wept not from fear, but from exhaustion. From the knowledge that again there was nothing they could do. Famine rarely traveled alone. It brought with it illness, and illness brought with it famine. When a household fell ill, the fields went untended. The livestock, if any remained, wandered. The food stores dwindled faster, shared with the sick, used for thin soups that could not sustain. One person's weakness became the family's burden. One death brought not only grief, but less labor, less hope. The bread, when there was bread, became both healer and harbinger. Hard and dark, often laced with bits of straw or chaff, it offered calories without strength. It filled the stomach, but not the bones. It carried molds and fungi that in some seasons caused more harm than good. People ate because they feared the pain of emptiness more than the risk of poison. And the children, those most vulnerable, those who had never known a season of abundance, were often the first to vanish. Their limbs thinned, their eyes grew too large for their faces, their bellies rounded not from health, but from lack. They clung to mothers with fingers like reeds, asking for food, then asking no more. Old age came early. A man of 30 might walk like one of 70. A woman of 25 might have lost 5 children and still bear the weight of more to come. The village graveyard grew not just from war or plague, but from the quiet daily wear of the cycle that never broke. Eat little, grow weak, fall ill, lose more. Doctors, where they existed, were scarce and their knowledge limited. Herbs were used, yes, nettle, sage, garlic, but none could replace a full meal, none could substitute warmth and rest. Prayers were said over fevers, holy water sprinkled, relics kissed. But in the end, the cure was not healing, but survival, to last another day. To bury the dead and keep breathing. There were years, dark years, when whole villages thinned, when the bells tolled too often, when the parish priest no longer knew how to comfort, only how to bury, when records of the dead blurred with the names of those forgotten, and the survivors looked upon one another not in celebration, but in silence. This was not a world where health returned easily. Once the body slipped into the realm of disease, brought low by hunger, it rarely came back unchanged. The cough never quite stopped. The limp never fully disappeared. The memory of fever clung like smoke to skin. People survived, yes, but they survived with scars too deep for the eye to see. And so the cycle continued. The year passed. The fields were planted again, slowly. Some harvests were good, some not. But the fear remained. the memory of months without bread, the cries in the night. The earth that took too many, it lingered, always, because hunger and sickness in the medieval world were not events. They were conditions, states of being, and they shaped not only the flesh, but the very way people understood time, family, and faith. In every furrow of the land, in every line on a mother's face, in every unmarked grave beyond the church walls, this truth remained. To be poor was to be hungry. To be hungry was to be sick. To be sick was to be forgotten. Unless someone remembered, unless someone told the story, as we do now. Long before the cold truly arrived, long before the first snow fell quietly upon the fields, fear had already crept into the homes of the medieval poor. It lived not in dramatic gestures, but in the smallest of acts, in the cautious slicing of an onion, in the hidden glance at a dwindling sack of barley, in the sigh after tasting a broth that had already been watered down too many times. In summer, food could be gathered. In autumn, it could be preserved, but once the last leaf fell and the wind began to sharpen, everything became a question of survival. The rhythm of life slowed. Days shortened so quickly that dusk seemed to arrive before labor had even begun. Fires were lit earlier, and meals were eaten in silence, as if speech itself wasted energy that could no longer be spared. The poor planned for winter, not with strategy, but with dread. They relied on instinct, on inheritance, not of wealth, but of fear. Grandmothers passed down recipes not to delight, but to stretch ingredients until they became almost symbolic. A single onion flavored an entire pot. A piece of salted pork was boiled and reused until it gave up every last echo of its taste. Bread was cut thinner each day, crusts softened in broth so that the youngest could chew. Clothing was mended over and over again. Wool, when available, was coarse and unyielding, but better than nothing. Straw was stuffed into shoes. Blankets were layered, but still never warm enough. Sleep became lighter, more fragmented, as cold seeped into the bones. Children cried in the night, elders coughed for hours. The hearth, when it glowed at all, was a luxury. Wood was precious and often wet. Outside, animals huddled together or died. Rats invaded granaries. Mold crept into the corners of food stores. The roofs, heavy with snow, leaked. Water froze in the buckets before it could be drunk. Getting to the well was a journey in itself, and the cold stung the face so sharply that tears froze before they could fall. The winter did not only starve the body, it starved the mind. It pressed upon the spirit. Laughter, common in spring, became rare. Songs quieted. Even prayer changed its tone. People did not ask for prosperity. They begged simply to make it through, to reach the other side, to see the trees in bloom once more. Sickness traveled with the cold. Joints swelled. Lungs filled. Skin cracked and bled. Without nutrition, every illness lingered. And with the doctor too far or non-existent, people relied on old herbs, whispered cures, the laying on of hands. Most of the time it was not enough. And yet they endured. They dug deeper into their own resolve. They told stories by candlelight, if they had candles. They whispered lullabies to children who woke crying from hunger. They buried the dead with frozen hands, sometimes waiting days to break the ground. They hung on. Because winter, in the medieval world, was not just a season. It was a reckoning. It revealed who had prepared enough, who had allies, who had strength left to give, and who would not see the spring. When the thaw began, it did so slowly. Drips from rooftops, patches of mud, a bird returning. But no one celebrated too soon. They knew better. March could still bring blizzards. April, floods. Spring arrived reluctantly, like a child afraid to wake its father. Only when the buds finally pushed through the cold soil, when the lambs were born, when the first green leaves unfurled, did people begin to hope aloud. But even then, they carried the memory of the cold that stole names, of the nights they held their breath, of the hunger that taught them to count every grain, every root, every drop of warmth. And they looked to the sky, already wondering, how long until it comes again? Because the fear of winter never left. It simply stepped into the shadows, waiting for its turn to return. There is a kind of mourning that does not wear black or stand beside fresh graves. A mourning that happens in kitchens with empty shelves, in pantries that echo, in hands that reach into sacks and find only air. In the medieval world, this mourning was as constant as the hunger that fed it, a grief for meals that were never cooked, for tables that were never set, for mouths that opened and waited and closed without swallowing. In many homes, the grief took root before the hunger had even ended. It was not a sudden tragedy, but a slow unraveling of hope. The last crust of bread was broken with a silence that said more than words. The pot, once kept simmering with herbs, bones, and the memory of vegetables, sat cool and dry on the hearth. The grain sacks, stitched from flowery linen and handed down from mother to daughter, hung limp like shrouds. To lose someone to starvation was to carry a sorrow that never truly settled. Because it wasn't a sickness to treat, it wasn't a war wound to explain, it was a shame felt deeply, whispered about behind hands. What kind of family lets their child go hungry? What kind of village buries the old with nothing in their bellies? And so the grief turned inward. Families marked their mourning in small, persistent rituals. An extra seat at the table was left, not in expectation, but in reverence. Some would wrap a spoon in cloth and place it near the bed of the dead, as if to say, "You should have eaten more. You deserved more. We are sorry." Stories were told of loved ones who had died not just of lack, but of waiting. A mother who fed her sons and said she wasn't hungry. A father who walked through 3 villages, begging for work or a trade, and returned with only tears. A sister who grew quieter each day, whose hands thinned until they could no longer hold the ladle. And yet, in all of this, no laments were sung aloud. No public acknowledgement declared a death by famine a tragedy of injustice. It was, as the priest said, a test of faith, or worse, a punishment. Villagers often made up rituals to cope. A small piece of bread might be buried in the earth with the dead. A handful of wheat scattered into rivers, as if to return it to the cycle that had failed them. In some homes, bowls were left filled with water overnight, untouched, a silent invitation to ghosts who had died with thirst in their throats. Children were told stories to soften the ache, of angels who came to take away hunger, of fields in heaven where the barley never spoiled, of saints who walked barefoot and never felt hunger. These tales were not mere distractions. They were scaffolding for grief, a way to make sense of a world that let some feast and others wither. Neighbors shared grief through glances. A woman passing another might press a small bag of oats into her hand, wordlessly. An old man might knock at the door holding a single egg, knowing it would not change the past, but perhaps soften the memory. And all of it, every gesture, every ritual, every silence, was laced with the heaviness of what might have been. If only the rains had come earlier, if only the Lord had taxed less, if only the monastery had shared, if only. This collective mourning became part of the landscape. Fields remembered. Trees that once shaded a dying child were not cut. Stones near the river, where someone had collapsed in weakness, were never moved. The very earth held the stories, and when the next planting came, the grief was still there. In the cautious way seeds were handled, in the prayers murmured with planting, in the way mothers counted handfuls of grain before pouring them into the pot, as if measuring time itself. The food that never came haunted the living. It shaped the way they ate, the way they gave, the way they feared. It shaped the lullabies. It shaped the silences. And though the world turned, and seasons cycled, and new children were born, the absence of those who had waited for food in vain remained. Their names might fade, but their hunger did not. It lived on in memory, in the rituals of care, in the sacredness of a shared meal, and in the enduring sorrow for what should have been given and never was. To understand hunger in the medieval world is not to imagine a momentary lack, a missed meal, or a passing discomfort. It is to understand an entire way of living and of dying. Hunger was not an exception, it was the rule, not a crisis that arrived with catastrophe, but a quiet thread stitched into the very fabric of daily life. And over time, it did more than cause suffering. It shaped thought, it defined behavior. It built a collective identity passed down through generations, not as a scar, but as a bone-deep inheritance. In village after village, from the windswept coasts of the North Sea to the sunburnt interiors of southern Iberia, hunger was the first teacher. It taught children to wait, to share, to hide food when possible, to lie about being full, to pretend with aching sincerity that they didn't mind. The first lessons weren't letters or prayers, but rituals of survival, how to stretch a crust, how to sip broth slowly, how to silence the stomach when there was nothing to give it. Even where the land was fertile, abundance did not mean relief. The systems that controlled food, the tithe, the tax, the titanic weight of feudal obligations, ensured that hunger remained a constant. A family might reap but not receive, might sow but not eat, might kneel before a field in bloom, only to watch the best of its harvest carried off to manor cellars or monastery granaries. This constancy gave hunger a philosophical weight. It became more than biology, it became belief. In sermons, hunger was sanctified. Priests preached poverty as a path to piety, taught that fasting brought one closer to heaven, and yet the poor did not fast. They starved, not for God, but because there was no bread. Still they listened, they folded their hands, they whispered, "Amen," even as their stomachs twisted. Hunger influenced how people understood the divine. In dreams, God often appeared as a provider, a shepherd with loaves, a mother figure with warm stew. Heaven itself was imagined as a place where food never ran out, where tables were always full, where no one was asked to wait. The body of the peasant was shaped by this philosophy. Thin not by choice, but by structure. Bones too visible. Bellies distended from lack. Joints swollen from saltless diets. The hunger etched itself into the skin, into the teeth, into the gait, and into the soul. Because to hunger, year after year, is to develop a memory of absence, a kind of generational anxiety. Even in times of slight abundance, there was no peace. Every full cupboard whispered, "It won't last." Every meal was eaten with caution. The tongue tasted salt and fat and wondered if it would be the last. Parents passed this caution to their children not only through meals, but through stories, tales of the bad harvests, of the winter where the river froze too soon, of the summer when the rains never came. These stories weren't merely warnings. They were liturgies, narratives of resilience, of grief, of community. They taught that to survive was to remember, and that remembrance was a duty. This remembrance found its way into customs, into how people gave thanks, into how food was stored, blessed, and shared, into how neighbors supported one another because they knew what it meant to go without. Even resistance took shape around hunger. To steal bread was a crime, yes, but to many it was also a protest, a refusal to let systems claim one's last dignity, a demand, however quiet, that life should not be decided by what a stomach could bear. And so, over centuries, hunger became a kind of heritage. It shaped what people expected of life. It lowered the horizon of joy. It carved humility deep into the collective heart. And it created a culture where survival itself became a form of wisdom, where knowing how to ferment cabbage, how to dry herbs, how to trap rabbits, or grind acorns into flour was sacred knowledge, passed from hand to hand, mother to daughter, elder to child. We often imagine identity through language, through banners, through borders. But for much of history, it was hunger that defined belonging. You knew who your people were by how they responded to an empty pot, by the rituals they practiced, the stories they told, the ways they mourned food lost and celebrated food shared. Even today, this inheritance lingers in families who clean every plate, in cultures where feeding others is the highest form of respect, in the quiet panic some feel when the pantry grows bare, even for a moment. It lingers in us not as shame, but as memory, as history, as proof that once a people survived on less than nothing and made a life anyway. There is a silence that descends not in peace but in exhaustion, the kind of quiet that comes after years of scraping bowls, of watching loved ones shrink, of working earth that gives little and takes much. This was the silence of survival in the medieval world. To eat was not to celebrate. It was not the centerpiece of joy or abundance. It was an act of resistance. A daily negotiation with chance, with season, with power, with the fragility of the human body. Meals, when they happened, were not defined by taste, but by presence. There was something to chew, something to sip, something, however small, that kept the body going one more day. The kitchen was not a place of warmth and experimentation. It was often a corner of packed dirt, a pot hung by string or rested on stones, and a ladle worn smooth by repetition, a handful of greens, a torn piece of bread. A few spoonfuls of porridge cooked thin to stretch into enough. Women mostly held the burden of this quiet feeding, their labor invisible, their knowledge unspoken, passed through gestures rather than words. They knew how to flavor water with bones long stripped of meat. They knew which weeds would not poison, which roots softened best with boiling. They listened not for hunger, but for the silence that followed it. That silence was always more dangerous. And so they stirred. They peeled. They portioned. They prayed. They fed others before themselves, not out of virtue, but out of necessity, because a mother's hunger could be hidden. A child's could not. Villages moved in rhythm with scarcity. A neighbor might have food on Monday and none on Thursday. Sharing was not charity, it was strategy. To keep one another alive was the only way to ensure someone would remain to return the favor. The sounds of these lives were soft, a ladle against a pot, a whispered blessing. A cough from behind the door where someone had eaten too little for too long. And between these sounds, silence. The silence of choosing who eats. The silence of lying to a child. The silence of washing a bowl no one used. That silence lived in the walls, in the wood smoke, in the cracked hands that fed with love and shame in equal measure. And yet within it there was resilience. A stubborn refusal to vanish, a refusal to let the world erase them with hunger. Even in the darkest seasons, when snow-covered fields and frost settled inside windows, the pot still simmered, even if it held little more than water and memory. People found ways to survive, to endure, to scrape by. Not because they were fearless, but because they had no choice. This kind of living left marks not only on bodies, but on hearts. It taught caution, yes, but also care, fierce, silent care, and it is that care that lingers in the stories. The story of the woman who fed a stranger the last of her flour, the boy who trapped a bird and split it 6 ways, the old man who refused his portion so a new mother could eat. These are not grand tales. They are quiet, like the hunger that surrounded them, but they matter, because they remind us that history is not only made of kings and battles, it is made of soups, of shared crusts, of the human will to keep others fed, even in a world that seemed determined to let them starve. Tonight, if your table holds warmth, if your plate is full, know that this comfort is not isolated. It echoes. It reaches backward, to every hand that stirred a pot, to every body that bent over a field, to every spirit that whispered, "Not much, but enough." May their silence never be mistaken for absence. May their survival be remembered as the quiet triumph it was. And may we, in honoring their memory, carry their legacy of care, not just in food, but in love. Have a peaceful night. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into the past, I'd be grateful if you gave a quiet click on the like button and subscribed for more winding journeys through the captivating and complicated annals of history. Until next time, sweet dreams.